So the title of this talk is Creating a Safe Psychobiological Environment by Healing Yourself to Heal Others. And when I thought about which aspect of my book I wanted to talk about, I got a little bit overwhelmed because I cover a lot of territory in this book, starting from the history of sex addiction and what Patrick Carnes endured as he fought, as a solo practitioner to bring this idea of sex addiction to the world, and the way that he was really pummeled. And he was one person. We now have an army of persons. And just the trajectory of the field and how it changed. I also talk about early childhood attachment and the importance of the infant-mother dyad in bringing up the right hemisphere, the right brain rather, and the autonomic nervous system. Then I talk about addiction, and the whole dopamine system that we're all enamored with. And then culture and treatment, and on it goes. So when I really distilled it down, I thought the most important thing really is who we are as therapists. And who we are as therapists is at the core of regulation theory. And I just want to remind you that attachment theory moved from John Bowlby's ideas about safety and security to a modern approach that Alan Shore brought to the world of attachment theory really being a theory of regulation, of how our brains and bodies are set up early on so that we are securely attached people. So in this model, the therapist's very own self is at the center of the process. There was a time when Carl Rogers, actually in 1957, he wrote a book called The Necessary and Sufficient Conditions, sorry about that, of Therapeutic Personality Changes. And that was a revolutionary paper because he was talking about unconditional positive regard for the patient. Before that, the psychoanalysts sat on high and made interpretations about your life, and they were the expert on your life. And there was, by way of interpretation, an insight you were supposed to get better. And it turns out you just got neurotic. You really understood what was wrong with you, but nothing changed that much. So Rogers came along and said, hey, I'm going to unconditionally regard this human being opposite me. I'm going to give them love and caring and see them differently. And that was a paradigm buster at that time. The whole humanistic movement emerged from that. But the folly in that was that it was still a one-person system. And regulation theory is a two-person dyadic system. You are bringing all of who you are to the work, which makes a difference and how people change. And we know this from neuroscience now. So healing ourselves is imperative if we're going to heal others, because then we can reach our own human potential and our patients can reach their potential. So all of the images you're going to see here today are from Jung's Red Book, and I chose them because they are spectacularly evocative. It's just amazing that he was this creative, and not surprising, really. And he talked about the relational unconscious. That's really what he talked about. And I'm going to talk about that a lot, but not just from a Freudian and Jungian perspective, but from a regulation theory perspective. So, well, I was 28 years old. I don't know how long ago it was, but 28 years old, let's put it that way. And at that time, I had left a 10-year relationship with a man who was 16 years older than I. I really had no idea who I was. I left my father's home as soon as I could. I was 19, and this guy was 36, and I moved to California, just wanting to get away from home, because home was such a difficult place for me. And I left that relationship because it was fraught with all sorts of issues, some of which were sexual, not surprising because my father had sexual issues. And I went to LA to become an actress. And while I was there, I was starving like every other actor in Hollywood, and I answered an ad in a newspaper called Backstage West, which was an adaptation from Backstage in New York. And a film student was making a film at USC, and this was common. People do these things. They do plays and films to get, more experience. So I went to USC and I auditioned for this movie. It was a black and white movie on Super 8 film, no sound. It was for a class. And I met this man who was 32 at the time, and I was very attracted to him, and so he hired me for the part. And we fell in love. And the way that people fall in love after they've known each other for a grand total of a month. Um, and we made this movie, and the story of the movie was a boy meets girl movie. And the boy meets girl, and they're having all this fun, and they're listening to music and dancing, and one day you see them racing cars down a street. He's in his car and she's in her car, and they have an accident. And we stage this accident with his car and my car. And the girl, me, is laying on the ground, and you don't know if she's dead or alive. Until the end of the movie, when they're walking through the Santa Monica Mountains, he's walking by himself down a mountain trail, and you don't know what happened. And then I come around the corner, and he sees me, and his face lights up, and we walk down the path happily ever after. Several weeks after we made that movie, we went to Santa Barbara for Thanksgiving. He wanted me to meet his friend's family because his own mother had hung herself, and he found her when he was 17 years old. And that sent him to India for many years to study TM and study with the leader of TM. And then after that, he went to Chicago and got his bachelor's degree in Western philosophy, which I thought was fascinating because I was really interested in comparative religion. So we went and met his family, and we ate turkey, and we laughed, and we ate sugar and more turkey. And we were exhausted by the end of the night, and then we went to a movie. We went to see Star Wars or something. So we woke up the next morning groggy and decided to go to Marie Callender's for breakfast before we headed off to LA, where we had turkey pot pie and more sugar. So as we were driving home on this warm Southern California afternoon, we were talking about our plans for the future, what we were going to do, how excited we were, and I got so exhausted that I looked at him and I said, "Just hold that thought." And I just laid my head over into his lap and fell into a deep sleep. The next thing I knew, the car was coming to a rolling stop. I opened my eyes and I heard glass shattering. I looked down and saw his feet on the pedals of the car. And I got up, I lifted myself up, and I had a white skirt on, and it was splattered with blood. And I looked at my watch, and it said 3:10 p.m. And I looked over at him, and what I thought I saw was that his face was bloody terribly. And I thought, oh my God, we have to get to a hospital. We have to get him to an ambulance. And then there were people pulling at the car door, trying to get me out of the car, and some woman grabbed me and wrapped blankets around me, and she said, "You're going to go into shop. We have to keep you warm." And the traffic was stopped on the 101. So she walked me behind the car, and when I looked at the car, the back of the car was splattered in blood, and I felt my knees buckle. And she said, "Don't look." So I turned my head over my left shoulder, and there sat my boyfriend's head, upright on the asphalt. So my whole life changed in that moment. For a week after that, I was in love with just love itself. Everything seemed beautiful. Colors were brighter. I was in love with homeless people. I could see the humanity in people in a way I'd never had before. I wanted to hug homeless people. I'd see a mother at a bus stop with her child and was sure I was seeing the face of God in that moment. But the week after that, I went into a very deep depression, a deep abyss unlike anything I'd ever known before. And it was in that moment that I, knew that I didn't know who I was. And there were doctors that wanted to put me on Valium at the time, and I thought, wow, if I do that, I'll wake up with a nice drug addiction in 6 months or a year. So I decided to dive deeply into those feelings. And I cried and cried and cried some more. I cried every day for a year. I would cry in the grocery store if I saw a man that looked like my father fondling oranges, looking for the right orange. It was a really intense period where I did nothing but go to movies and cry. So why am I telling you this story? I'm telling you the story because it's what catapulted me into therapy. I was forced to my knees into therapy. Just like many of you have been forced into your knees in therapy by way of addiction, and why people become addiction therapists who are in recovery from addiction. And so also, when we think about treating addiction, people often say, well, I'm a trauma therapist, and there's a little part of me that laughs inside because I think if we're treating addiction, we are treating trauma. It's what we all do now. And so Jung said that neuroses is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. So many of you in this room have legitimately suffered. Kate, for example, who suffered profound neglect growing up with an alcoholic mother. Doug, who endured an alcoholic, shaming father and a mother who enmeshed him. Penny, who was raised in a domestically violent household till she was 4 with a depressed mother. Mario, who grew up with a sexually addicted father. And Linda, who was abandoned as a child and raised in a children's home. So what are you noticing in your body right now as I'm telling you this story, and as you hear me call out your colleagues? Is your heart beating faster? Are you afraid I'm going to call you out next? Are you incredulous that I just outed my colleagues, which they gave me permission, by the way? This feeling that's happening between us in your body right now is an intersubjective knowing. This is the collective unconscious. This is the implicit conversation that we're meant to be in with our clients every single day, every time we work with them. So one of these brave souls wrote something to me, and I just want to read it. She said, "I'm acutely aware that this is what I've lived through, and the subsequent healing work that is one of my greatest gifts and skills as a therapist, and something I must and get to continue to work actively with. This is a therapist who's daring enough to see the gifts in her adversity. You can't escape who you are, and when you're working through the lens of interpersonal neurobiology, we recognize that the brain and the body develop in relation to one another. And we're therefore in a parallel process with our clients all the time. So I would ask you, what scares you about looking deeply into your process?" Jung said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." Well, sex addiction and recovery from sex addiction is certainly an inferno of the passions. So our issues come up in relationship with everybody, whether it's a family member, a loved one, a lover, a neighbor, but they come up in relationship to our clients every single hour of the day. And if you're in an actual relationship with your client, not a symbolic one of the old Freudian days where I'm transferring my mother onto you, yeah, that's probably happening. But there's a real-time, real relationship that's happening now that puts the therapist dead center of the process. You cannot phone this in if you're going to do it well. So have you suffered any trauma? And if so, how do you grapple with that trauma that you've suffered? And what do you have to do to overcome that? When I was in therapy with a therapist who saved my life, a man named Dr. John Cogswell, who has since passed away, he said to me, "Alex, the most important work you'll do as a therapist is on this couch." And I've never forgotten his words, because people ask me all the time, where did you train, or what kind of certification do you have in all of this? And sometimes once I said nothing, or I've never trained to somebody, which is not true. I have training, but I don't have any formal protocol in somatic working. I learned it by tracking the impulses of my body on his couch with him. And no book ever taught me that, no training ever taught me that. So I'm the child of a World War II survivor. And the intergenerational trauma impacted my ability to be in an intimate relationship. It impacted my regulatory capacities, my self-esteem. I had a lot of shame about who I was as a child, and I had a lot of difficulty with my emerging sexuality as a teen. My father, who you see in this picture here as a young man, was born in 1928, and his father died of alcoholism. His father was a doctor, and he was drinking isopropyl alcohol at some point because he was working in the killing fields during World War I. And my grandmother, who I'm named after, the late, great Alexandra Katehakis, who used to remind me that she was the original, had twins before my father was born, and they died of SIDS when they were 2 years old. So I'm pretty sure my grandmother had anaclitic depression. She'd lost her husband, she'd lost twins, she'd probably had postpartum depression, and there was an impending war showing up on her shores. When my father was 12 years old, he found himself in front of a firing squad, and then again as a teenager. My grandmother saved him both times because she spoke German. She also housed some of the German officers in their apartment. No one in her village died, and she was awarded a medal from the Greek government at the end of the war. So she was a fierce, fierce woman, and the Cretan people are fierce people. In fact, when the paratroopers first landed on the island of Crete, they were met by old people with rocks and sickles and rusty rakes and guns, and they obliterated the Nazi paratroopers, which Hitler didn't like very much, so he came back with a vengeance. It was a very violent time that my father endured, and it wasn't until about 7 years ago that I figured out that all this anxiety that I run at times was intergenerationally transmitted to me. I mean, I always thought about it, we know about it from Jewish people, from the Holocaust, but it hit me like a ton of bricks on that day. So I looked at the symptoms of intergenerational transmission of trauma in children born to the Holocaust, and what I found was that this idea first came up in 1966, when it was described of children of Holocaust survivors. And then in 1998, children struggled silently with war-derived messages from their parents. Struggled silently. That sounds like dissociation to me. That there is an implicit intergenerational transmission taking place. It doesn't mean they were beat or hit or anybody even talked about these stories. In fact, one of the ways Holocaust experts started working with survivors was getting them to tell their stories. That's what the Shoah Foundation was about. So it wasn't just the storytelling, they were feeling it in the household. And they suffered from all of these symptoms, which you'll see here. This is the language of 1979, impaired object relations, personality constriction, which sounds like overregulation, narcissistic vulnerability, low self-esteem, negative identity formation, shame-based sense of self, I would think, an affective impairment, which could have been pathological dissociation. So then I looked at substance users and domestic violence victims, and look at what we see: codependence due to inordinate caretaking. Codependence is a survival mechanism. We use it, we think it's a dirty word or it's pejorative. It's really a survival mechanism, and I saw this quite acutely when I was with Marilyn Murray in Russia about 4 summers ago now. And I got to sit in with her and teach some of her classes with her. And these trauma eggs ran from the ceiling all the way to the middle of the floor, because she hands out wallpaper, and they do them on the back of wallpaper rolls. And it was profound to see how these people, we would call them enmeshed or codependent, but they were just surviving the Soviet system. Little to no global sense of self, behavioral and emotional problems, shame, pathological dissociation, anxiety, and PTSD. So if you look at these, there's a correlation. So that tells us that any kind of trauma is trauma, and any kind of trauma impacts the human organism in the same way. So this is a saying that we read a lot at Center for Healthy Sex, and remind ourselves, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, don't assign tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. So I'm not here to necessarily teach you anything today. I'm not here to teach you a technique. You already have tons of techniques and certifications and really know what you're doing in large part. I really want to challenge you to think about how you move towards your full potential, How do you take the best and all of who you are and infuse it into the therapy that you're doing? Jung said that the shadow is a moral problem and challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the essential condition for any kind of self-knowledge, and it therefore meets with considerable resistance. So it's interesting that he thought about this as a moral issue, because I keep turning this over because, again, it's sort of creaky older language, that it's a moral problem that challenges the ego. So morality is a higher cortical function, but the ego is really sort of the left brain. It's the part of us that just knows everything. It's the know-it-all part of us. And so to become conscious of the shadow means that we have to grapple with these two parts of ourselves. And it means that we have to recognize the dark aspects. We have to recognize that we're perfectly imperfect, as Pia Melody says, that there are two of us going on at all times. Sometimes I feel like this unruly creature where my body and my limbic brain wants to do something over here and my cortex is saying, no, don't do it, and there's this thing going on sometimes. But that's just the human condition. So when we recognize these as present, as he's saying, we're going to meet with considerable resistance when we try to make these changes. So I would ask you, what's in your way? Is it the fear of the unknown? Is it money? Is it that I don't have enough time? What excuses do you tell yourself? Maybe that you've already done your work, and you probably have already done your work or you wouldn't be in this room. But who are you today? What are you up against today? Because we're changing so rapidly, the world is moving so quickly that we're constantly figuring out who we are moment to moment. And how secure are you really? I earned my secure attachment. I didn't come with it. Well, I came with the mechanism for it, as we all did, but the way it got encoded was much more anxious and avoidant. So I had to earn that secure attachment through years of therapy, through a secure love relationship. But if you put me under pressure or under duress, guess what? I can become an anxious, avoidant mess again. And so being aware of that, and how do we use that, and how do you work with that is the question. Are you on a path of self-awareness? Do you see this as a lifelong process of generativity, or is it kind of a one-and-done thing? Because that's dangerous for therapists. We sit in a power position. We are considered experts at what we do. And it's very dangerous if we take that too far, or if we get lazy about the responsibility of that. So what stands in your way? What are your greatest obstacles? How compassionate are you with yourself? Do you invite these negative thoughts and emotions in and embrace them? And are you kind to yourself? Or do you perpetrate more violence on yourself on any given day by calling yourself stupid or an idiot or not good enough or, blah, blah, blah? We could make a mixtape if we wanted to of all of that, right? So I want to look at what's required of us to work in this relational way. Jung says knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. So I've been very interested in this notion of self-deception. There was a conversation on the SASH listserv recently about lying and how we lie to ourselves and how we lie to our patients. And I thought, what about the ways we lie to ourselves? That self-deception is a little bit different than lying. And deception is an evolutionary function. It's in nature. We see it all the time. You've all watched, Discovery Channel before, and, you see birds that blend in with trees and snakes that blend in with logs and zebras that blend in with striped backgrounds. These are survival mechanisms. So deception, self-deception, is a way that we've survived. And when we don't confront this self-deception, we have blind spots in our therapy. And we're always going to have blind spots because we never know what we don't know. But if we know we're lying to ourselves because we've cut ourselves off sexually, Or we don't really want to bother with that little depressive dysthymic thing that hangs around sometimes. That's a form of self-deception. The gaps between the left and right side of the brain represent the neurobiological explanation for self-deception. So, there's this very thick nerve bundle between the right and left brain called the Corpus Callosum, and that's how data travels between the right and left. So if you imagine that the right brain is a cortical column, let's say I have a left brain right here, like I'm the brain, this is the brain stem, and this is down into the body. Information goes from right to left and back again, but there are no connectors from the left down into the body. It crosses callosally and goes down. So all the information's going up and down on the right. The left brain is linear. It fires in linear sequence. It's logical, it's linguistic, but the right is this complex, nonlinear dynamic system that's constantly shuttling information, and that circuitry has to be robust. Because when the cortical is functionally not engaged with the subcortical, dissociation is a symptom. You get alexithymia, people can't feel anything in their bodies. Those circuits are flat, they're dead, they're limp. That's why you get depression, anxiety, low tonicity in the body. You can tell it when you hug somebody. People, hug robustly because they feel it in their bodies, and others are just limp because they don't have these connectors going back and forth. I had a client who came into treatment many years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago now, and his wife called me first, and she was distressed because she found something on his phone. And I talked to her on the phone. She was out of town. She came in, I saw her. He came in by himself. They came in together, and I told him I thought he should go to a 45-day inpatient program, and boy, did he not like me. He was angry, but he was angry in that way that smelled of terror. He was sweaty. You could see the snarl on his face. He wanted to do an intensive program at night because, he was going to lose his career, and I just didn't understand that. And I said, well, I understand a lot, I was thinking, because I knew this guy was in deep trouble. I knew that he was profoundly traumatized. So he went away to the Gentle Path program when it was in the South. And when he came back, he said to me, I feel like I've been skinned alive. And I thought, well, that's a good sign, isn't it? But what he was saying was that he said there was a titanium wall between my acting out behavior and my life. And never did I think that wall would lift, ever. And so when that wall started to lift, because they started to deconstruct the higher order defenses, the denial, the minimization, the rationalization, the easy things to deconstruct that are in the left brain, and then they started to move into the shame dynamics and the affect, which are the deeper dissociative defenses against too much data coming in through the central nervous system, and the system cannot handle it. That's when the subcortical and the cortical disconnect. It's a survival strategy. It helps us prepare to die. He had a psychotic mother. He had a father who was alcoholic in absence. He was sexualized by the mother. He was a heroin addict. The story went on and on. You all know the story. You know this guy. So that's the function of dissociation. And my colleague Dan Hill, who wrote a beautiful book called Affect Regulation Theory, which is essentially a primer on Alan Shore's work. So if you don't have time, energy, or tenacity to get through Shore's work, if you read Dan Hill's book, it's also part of the Norton series on interpersonal neurobiology, you'll find it all right there, beautifully laid out. But Dan says that pathological dissociation is composed of 3 things: compartmentalization, or automaticity, compartmentalization, and altered states of consciousness. So our brains are extremely automatic, and automaticity is adaptive. It's an adaptive strategy. I'm walking back and forth on the stage here, I'm talking to you. I'm not thinking, you better put one foot in front of the other, and it's left, right, left, and don't fall off the stage. No, None of that's happening. I'm automatically moving through this. You do it when you're driving and you're thinking about things. We automatically comport ourselves because this is an evolutionary strategy. It's fast, it's efficient. It can get us where we need to go if there's life threat taking place. So we don't stop and think. But when we shift out of spontaneity in relationships, we do it sometimes by being deliberate and sometimes not. But when it's automatic and it's not a deliberate choice, then we're involuntarily automated and we've dissociated. And we feel that with clients when we think they're blunted or they're flat. Subjectivity collapses. The person doesn't have an opinion about things. They don't really know what they think or feel or prefer. And intersubjectivity collapses. Someone came into my staff meeting last week and said, I want to talk about, we'll call him John Doe, and he said, this is the longest 50 minutes of my life. And everybody laughed in the way that you are. And I immediately thought, wow, this guy is not there. There's no self there. These circuits are down on the right. Compartmentalization, another component of pathological dissociation, is the involuntary isolation of content. So when we say our clients compartmentalize that they were acting out, that's sort of a preconscious situation there, what they know but they don't know. Or it's not really hurting anybody, they tell themselves, and they're dissociated enough that they believe that. But these dissociated self-states can be cordoned off as a result of trauma. Philip Bromberg talks about not-me states or sequestered self-states because our self-states are motivational states and they run in these sort of columns also from the right down into the body. So if I'm told that it's not okay to show feelings in this family, that part of me is sequestered. And I'm nice and I'm pleasant and I'm a good girl, but all of that is cordoned off, what Jung would call a shadow. These are motivational states in the brain and in the body. So we can't voluntarily be remembered, they can't voluntarily be integrated into our overall functioning. And addicts segregate their sense of self all the time when they're acting out. And so one of the most maddening and difficult things is when the partner is in tears and she's saying, what were you thinking? Why weren't you thinking about us? And I'm sitting over there thinking, honey, there was no thinking. There was no thinking going on. I understand this. They don't understand that. I would never say that. But it's that's one of those tight spots that we get into, where you can't just say, oh, the partner is so traumatized. This addict is pre-traumatized, and he's traumatizing himself by way of the sex addiction. That's no party, the way people treat themselves. So both of these human beings are deeply and profoundly traumatized and in horrendous pain. And finally, altered states of consciousness is the third component of pathological dissociation. This is derealization, depersonalization, when people literally feel like they're not in their bodies. We've all heard that story when someone says, I was being molested and I was on the ceiling. These are peri-traumatic defense mechanisms. These are elegant mechanisms that are encoded in the body. They prepare us to die. They keep us safe. When the lion is chasing you along the Sahara and you're running for your life because you're in fight, flight, sympathetic arousal, high adrenaline, high dopamine run state, and you start to tire and that animal is catching up with you and it's going to eat you alive, you dissociate and a flood of opioids wash in, so you feel like you're on heroin before you're killed. I would say that's a pretty cool system. And if you're a geek, you would think so too. So Jung said a socially strong man in his private life is a mere child, a socially strong man, a false self, right? Where his own states of feelings are concerned. So this is interesting. You have to remember that historically, psychologists were male. There's a time when this room would have been 9/10 male, and maybe there'd been a smattering of females in this room. And now the field has flipped dramatically. So it was the doctor, right, with the beard, who was, pontificating about things. His public discipline, which he demands quite particularly of others, goes miserably to pieces in private. So I think this is sort of an interesting way also of looking at why we do this work. Why do we do this work? We work with people who have been profoundly neglected as infants, traumatized as children, trammeled as teenagers, beat up as adults. This is some of the hardest work, I think, out there. You know, people think, Stephanie's goof about the Center for Sexy Health. I had a supervisee once who said to me, this is the most unsexy place I've ever worked. Because Holly, I don't know if Holly's here this morning, but yesterday she was talking about working at Gentle Path and, how she had to shut her sexuality down and how hard that was for her and how she's coming out of that. And, there's so much of ourselves we have to batten down to do this work. There's so much trauma and pain we're metabolizing all day long if we're working well. So our clients come in and they all say the same thing. They say, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing what I do? How can I stop doing what I do? Help me get out of this. So one of our jobs is to lead the way towards neural integration so that people can have a full experience of themselves, an integrated as opposed to disintegrated sense of self, so that ultimately they can figure out what their soul's desire is. So I want to review the various states of knowing, because Alan Shore says there are 4 states of knowing, and interesting, in Buddhism and some of the Eastern teachings, they talk about these states of being also. So the first one is the conscious brain. This is cortical. It's high up in our brains. And it's what we know. We know the colors of the room, we know that I'm talking, we know that you're having your coffee, we know what the bathroom is when we get out of here. It's extremely useful for navigating through the world. The preconscious is really located in the right orbital frontal cortex, and this is that place of sort of knowing, but I don't know. Things are right sort of on the tip of our brains in this point. So this is a high right executive function that is typically down with people who are addicted. This is the area of the brain that gives us the capacity for vision, to see into the future. I talk about this a lot in Mod 3 because of the vision table that we do. The unconscious is particularly in the right brain and specifically in the right amygdala. The left amygdala knows I'm afraid, and the left amygdala is saying, Alex, did you lock the door before you go to bed at night? As opposed to the right amygdala, which says, I have a sense of fear right now. They're very different. So the right brain is the seat of the unconscious, and specifically the right amygdala. This is deep, deep in the midbrain. And if you're interested ever, Marquette University every July offers a neuroanatomical dissection course, and it's one of the best and most fun things you could do if you're into the brain. It's on the campus at Marquette, which is beautiful. It's in Milwaukee. It's not terribly expensive at all. It's like, I don't know, maybe $400 or $500. And the teachers there are spectacular, and they're funny, and they're knowledgeable, and you go into the gross dissection lab and you literally dissect brains. So you get to see all of these functions. They also do a spinal laminectomy, so it's quite a deal if you decide to go, and it's only, a long weekend. So anyway, I'm in this dissection course, and I go because I want to this amygdala. This little thing is the source of so many problems. So they're teaching us about sagittal cuts, and you can see the insula cortex, and you can see these big structures. And I'm thinking, where is this thing? So you have to cut through this fatty part. And of course, brains in formaldehyde look like meatloaf. They don't really look like brains. And so you cut through this thing, and there's this tiny indentation, I'm not kidding you, half the size of your little finger, that's called the amygdaloid nucleus. And I was like, that's it? I mean, you can barely see the thing. This thing is the seat of our first memory, because memory is laid down in tracks in the right amygdala. So the mother's angry face, the borderline mother's angry face, the mother's smile, whether it's what they call a Duquesne smile, where when you smile, your eyes light up, or it's a striated smile from the borderline mother who's mad and she smiles, which is like a freaky Halloween smile. That gets embedded in the right amygdala. So now we have an addict who had a borderline rageful mother, and now he's got a wife who's crying hysterically, and she's angry because she's hurt. And we're saying, you need to have empathy for her. And his right amygdala is saying, run. Danger, Will Robinson. And he collapses. So that's why timing is everything. I'm not saying he shouldn't have empathy for her, he should, but he's hobbled, and we have to remember that, and we have to remember about timing of these issues. So much of us is driven by this subcortical brain. It's the same thing that happens when, you're walking down the road, or let's say you're walking down a dirt road at dusk, and you're hiking and you're in the woods, and all of a sudden you see something and boom, you jump because you think it's a snake. That's the amygdala that thinks it's a snake. Upon closer inspection, it's a stick, right? But these are rapidly firing things, and this is the automaticity. Finally, we have the deep unconscious, and the deep unconscious is the body, and Jung knew that. Freud knew it also, but he didn't have fMRIs, and so he dropped the projects he was working on in relation to that. But when I think of the deep unconscious, this is where we have to go, into the body, into the autonomic nervous system. So we have two distinctly different operating systems. We have two brains, essentially. We have a right brain and we have a left brain. The left brain is very, very interesting because Ian McGilchrist talks about the master and his emissary, the master being the right brain, the emissary being the left brain. But we live in a very left-leaning culture right now. It's all about what we know. It's very egocentric. Our secure attachment is down around 54% in this country. Narcissism is on the rise. I'm just going to continue from here. These hemispheres develop from right to left, okay? In the beginning, there's the body, and there's the right amygdala. That's it. So the mother is bringing up this right hemisphere, and I say mother because I'm talking about primary caregiver. She's bringing this right hemisphere up to fruition. A baby looks like a blob when it's born. By 3 months old, the cingulate cortex is online. It looks like a baby. It recognizes you. It socially engages. It smiles. That's all the stimulation going back and forth in this dyadic dance. But the left brain specializes in focused attention, super focused, and denial. It's the seat of power. Power dynamics and independence are lateralized to the left, motivating us towards independence and self-sufficiency. It's a very useful operating system, but it draws conclusions and it confabulates when there are gaps. We lie about things all the time, like, oh yeah, I knew that. It's like, you didn't know that. Yes, well, it's not that big of a thing. I'm going to just say I knew it. Right? This goes on all the time. I know I'm not alone in this. So this left brain is also incredibly useful because it helps us know things. And our beloved task-centered approach is a cognitive behavioral model that recruits the left brain because right away, and this is what distinguishes us from regular psychotherapists, is that we are onto these denial structures, these tertiary lies and denials, minimizing, rationalizing, denying, justifying, and we go after that pretty quickly. And all of Dr. Karn's work is designed to go after the prefrontal cortex. He said you've got to grab the prefrontal areas and not let go for the first 120 days. And so the evolutionary call now is not just to move from cold cognition to primary process, but it's the integration of the two. It's that we are constantly working from both of these places now so that we're more integrated in what we're doing. So I'm going to show you this quick clip of the conscious mind.
And the conscious mind. That's because our conscious mind is limited to the cerebral cortex, a wrinkled layer just 1 millimeter thick that wraps around your brain like a bathing cap. About 15 billion nerve cells can connect to activate new networks in fractions of a second. However, the fireworks of conscious thinking devours up more energy than the muscles of a top athlete, which is why our brain normally tries to do without our conscious mind. The brainstem regulates vital bodily functions like breathing and heart rate. The cerebellum coordinates all motoric routines like walking or grasping. And the limbic system knows us better than we know ourselves because it regulates everything that we feel. And this unconscious filter, the thalamus, is in charge of deciding what is new and important enough to share with us. That's why our brain always seems to know more than we know. Perhaps that's the reason why we have so little influence on...
Perhaps that's the reason we have so little influence on anything we do. So now I want to look at the seeking system. And I think this system is really important to understand because it ties so tightly with addiction. So Jaak Panksepp, who sadly died 2 weeks ago of cancer at age 73, who was really a genius and brought us unbelievable knowledge about our brains because he studied rats. He was called the rat tickler, affectionately. And he discerned that the architecture of our brain is identical to rats, except for our neocortex, obviously. But he delineated 7 motivational circuits in all mammals. Every single mammal have these circuits, and these circuits are the seeking circuit, and all of them originate in the brain. So there's seeking, there's care, there's play, lust, there's anger or rage, panic, fear as one circuit, and grief. And I think what happens with a lot of sex addicts is that the seeking circuit gets fused with lust and rage, or lust and pain. So the seeking circuit is also called the granddaddy of these circuits. Jaak called these primary process circuits, and I had the good fortune of having dinner with him one night in New York with my colleague Terry Marks Tarlow also. And I asked him about this when I was writing my book, and he said, it's not about the acquisition of the reward. He said, it's the seeking of the reward. The seeking is where the exuberance is, and that's the word that he used. He said, dopamine is exuberant in what it's looking for. And that was really, sort of an aha moment for me, because think about all the sex addicts you've worked with who say, yeah, I got there and she wasn't that attracted, but I had sex with her anyway, right? Or they stay online for hours and hours and hours, but there's no such thing as pornography addiction. I'm just cross-eyed and I'm there for hours and hours. It's the seeking mechanism. So this seeking system is coming up from the brain. It's going through the ventral tegmental area, which is called the mesolimbic dopamine system. We have a cortical dopamine system, which is motoric. So when people have Parkinson's disease, they're losing cortical dopamine. That's why their motor systems are shaking. This is a subcortical system. And it's driven by the anticipation of pleasure, not the acquisition of pleasure. So if you're not a porn addict or a sex addict and you're female, think about shoes. When I'm writing and my brain turns to mush, I start looking at shoes. So I'm cruising shoes to see what's missing. What do I like? How much are they? I put them in shopping bags. But I don't buy them, because if I bought them, I'd have a big problem. I mean big, like thousands of dollars worth of problems. But one day it struck me, I thought, oh, this is like porn. This is shoe porn. So you'll see how exuberant this system is and how it moves us through these various areas. So I'm going to talk to you about this. This is from Mark Lewis's book. And he talks about the ventral mafia of compulsion, right? Because this is the mafia that hijacks the brain. So the amygdala is where associative memory is located, which I told you about, imagery, emotion. And it sends messages of emotional potency via the neurotransmitter glutamate to the orbital frontal cortex. And the orbital frontal cortex then apprises it And you'll see these little G's are glutamate that are going back and forth, where details connected to pleasure and relief are awakened. So the amygdala gets an emotional read. It's like, huh, that looks interesting. It sends it to the orbital frontal cortex, which confirms, indeed, that is hot and interesting. And it sends, messages back. And then the ventral striatum here charges it with behavior. The ventral striatum saying, it's a go for it, dude, right? And it's converting these behaviors' value, this is a good thing, I want it, into action, go get it. So this is the chemistry of learning. This is how we learn and how we do things. And craving occurs because this ventral mafia of compulsion dominates the dorsal anterior cingulate. So if I had you raise your hand like this and say, just keep it up here now for the next 45 minutes, what do you think would happen? What? Tired. Your arm would start to get tired. So some of you would, just drop it pretty quickly. Others of you would slowly start to go down, and some of you would just macho sweat coming down your face until the hour was over. This is what happens to the anterior cingulate cortex. It's getting bashed with dopamine constantly, and it cannot control the impulses any longer. And that's the neuroscience of craving in a very kind of cartoonish, silly, simple way. So this is the glutamate going back and forth. This is the dopamine here. And you can see this is amplifying value, this whole feedback loop. And this feedback loop is motivating thrust or action, the go get it. So I found these two interesting pieces of art. This one is from Jung, which looks like Jung, right? He's got the ego here, which would be the cortex. The self and the unconscious, which would be the midbrain or the, the whole area of the limbic system. And then the shadow is down here in the deep unconscious. But this cartoon is in one of Panksepp's books. And what you see here is that he talks about primary process in the brain stem. And so you see these circuits of seeking, lust, care, rage, fear, panic, and play. These are affective circuits going up. And then these nonspecific arousals are all the hormones that we have, like acetylcholine and serotonin and norepinephrine, coming up from what they call the reticular activating system. So boom, it's up. And secondary process, we have empathy, trust, blame, pride, and shame. He actually has guilt here, but I think guilt doesn't belong there. I think guilt is a left brain function. Shame is in the body. It's hot. You know it. Your face blushes. It's a very different emotional state. And then up on high, he's got mentalization, containment, mindfulness, naming of feelings. So this is a helpful little cartoon to look at how where these different areas of the brain are. And I just thought it was interesting that Jung had made his own, he made the original version of it. So when Jung talked about the unconscious and Freud talked about the unconscious, they said that the unconscious is hidden for emotional reasons and can be revealed through therapy via introspection. So that was the thinking, that if you could introspect, you could heal yourself. But neuroscience tells us something different now. It tells us that the unconscious is made up of visual, physical, and social perceptions of other people. So what your retina is actually perceiving is a blur of what's going on. But you're filling it in because these data really aren't there as much as they're constructed by our imagination. Our expectations, our desires are automatically filling in the gaps. So it's no wonder that we can get along at all, because we all have such different perceptions of who people are and situations going on in the world and what's happening. So let's look quickly at the magic of the unconscious. This is another short clip.
You don't know this young woman, but whether you want to or not, in this very moment, you've already passed judgment on her. In a split second, you've already decided if you find her trustworthy, competent, likable. No doubt your brain is a state-of-the-art marvel, managing 90% of everything you do without letting you know, regardless of whether you're awake or asleep.
We're driven by our unconscious mind. Isn't that the interesting thing? So much of what we do is unconscious. The decisions we make are almost dictated to us. I often wonder who's in charge here. You know, who's running the show? How much control do we really have? Our brain can falsify information that comes onto the retina. It can falsify it. In other words, if we can override what is really out there and impress what we think should be out there. That's the way it works. It's very powerful.
Let's take a look at Leander and Raphael. The two students are wearing similar clothing, have a similar stature, but are different enough to tell apart. Do you think you would notice if Raphael started a conversation with you and in the middle of it was replaced by Leander? Yes? Then take a look at the test devised by American psychologist Daniel Simons.
Excuse me, I'm looking for a Volksbank.
Sorry?
Volksbank. I'm looking for a Volksbank.
Volksbank.
Yep.
Yeah? Let me think. Where is it? It's almost slapstick here. Yeah, there is one around the corner, up at Market Square.
You go to a doctor's office and you say, I have a pain in my stomach, and you don't want them to say, well, there could be aliens running around, because it could be, right? Why couldn't it be? You want them to go through what's most likely down the list, right? And that's what our brain does. The whole cognitive structure is we look at the world, we make mindsets of what's familiar, and we look out into the world in these mindsets.
Our world is getting more and more complex. An American psychologist calculated that today the human brain can simultaneously absorb 11 million units of information. However, we're only consciously aware of a maximum of 40. That's why New York is exhausting when we first visit it. But the more often we venture into places like Times Square, the more at ease we feel with it. That's because we shift to autopilot, and our brain fades out what is considered irrelevant or familiar.
Okay. So the right brain is the emotional caring part of us. Its gaze is intrinsically empathic. It enables global attention, and it investigates more broadly and flexibly, because remember, the left is highly focused. This is a broader, flexible way of seeing the world. It's also all emotion is lateralized to the right, and it motivates us towards care, towards intuition, towards instinct and bodily sensation. The right brain really is our master, as he was saying. And the locus of change for our clients is really in the right brain, because they come in a place of being imbalanced with little emotional intelligence, no erotic intelligence to speak of. And as therapists, we have to be integrated ourselves in order to take people into these more integrated places. And that happens as a result of a co-created intersubjective field. So here we see again the right orbital frontal cortex, essential for connection in therapy, the limbic system going down into the body. And the trend in the field is really working more from the inside out now and from the bottom up. And so my question is, how can we use ourselves in the process of treating trauma? How do we use ourselves every day in this process? So I looked at complexity theory, which my colleague who I mentioned before, Terry Marks Tarlow, is expert on. And she says that complexity theory is a contemporary science that exposes how processes such as development, new order, and change self-organize spontaneously and emerge at the edge of chaos. So all of us have had the experience with a client who's, crying, maybe deep, racking, belly-sobbing tears, and then when they come up out of that state, they actually take a deep breath to regulate the system, and then they smile and even start to laugh. And in that moment, we're seeing this organism self-organize, going into, on the verge of chaos, actually, self-organizing again, coming up spontaneously at a higher level of complexity. And that's what happens when we start to kindle these circuits that have dropped, that have broken, that are down. We want to bring these back up to fruition. And out of the chaos of overwhelming fears and anxiety, we have a better sense of what's really important, and that's what emerges as a result of it. So I'm pretty sure that pretty much everyone in this audience has felt confused about where you're going, who you are, what you're doing. I mean, these are existential questions we all grapple with. But I also wouldn't be surprised if you told me that when you're in that state, when you're grappling in that way, you're getting a better sense of what's important to you as a result. And so the complexity, the chaos, the falling apart, the falling back together again. And for sex addicts and their partners especially, the ability to be open to chaos as individuals is allowing this intersubjective field and this flexibility to change. So when people come in and they're in that state of crisis and chaos, we have to be regulated enough to say, that is a blessing. You wouldn't say that to anybody, right? Because they're not feeling that. That's a good way to get punched or for them to leave. But you have to know in your bones that they're at the edge of chaos because something new is about to break through. And what happens is people divorce, or they renegotiate their marriages to something good and beautiful and more amazing than they ever thought it could be. And it's really through this chaos that occurs. She also says that chaos theory is a nonlinear process that grounds us in the inevitable turmoil and limited predictability of life, which I love. Alan Watts in 1958 wrote a book called The Wisdom of Insecurity, where he similarly talked about how insecure we really are, how things are changing all the time. We're always grasping to knowing and to being secure. And what I'm pointing to is this willingness to just let go, to be in chaos, to not know what's going on. So I would ask you here, have you excavated the inner resources of your psyche using your body as a portal into these dimensions? Or do you do what a lot of us do and have done? Do you use strategies to become a good person in the world because you want to leapfrog the deepest aspects of yourself? But you know, and I know, when our patients try and leapfrog the deepest aspects of themselves and we're complicit with it, they leave therapy. Patrick Carn says people get better enough. And when people get better enough and leave, I always feel a little bit of sadness about that. A little bit like, I failed that person. Now, Judy Shore comes to my study groups with Alan Shore because our study groups are in their living room, and there are a grand total of 10 of us on any given day. And she comes and goes in, she barges in, she talks to him, she'll ask him what he wants for lunch in the middle of the study group. And, because we're sitting there reverentially and she's in her home. And one day she said, you know what, some people just don't want to get better. And that was sort of a relief to hear also. But when we can move people towards their full potential, we want to be able to. And if we're stuck, it's because we're stuck in ourselves. It's not because they're stuck. It's like taking your car to a mechanic and you're saying, I need you to fix my car. And he says, I don't really know what I'm doing. That's his fault, not mine if I leave and go someplace else. So part of this is working with the body. Sassenfeld, who's a scholar of Jung, says working clinically with the concept of the body as shadow implies paying attention to bodily phenomenon in the treatment situation. This assumes that what the body expresses is often a direct manifestation of the shadow because the body's the deep unconscious. So how do I use my countertransference, and how do I use my somatic countertransference? Countertransference are your thoughts and feelings about the client. Those are pretty manageable. You can think about it, you can talk to somebody about it, but our somatic cues are what link ours and our patient's subjectivities together. And they bring us into a crucial right brain to right brain bodily-based communication. And our body is key. It's a key tool for receiving knowledge from the person sitting opposite us. It's what Stone calls using your body as a tuning fork. Because our body is precisely how we're picking up these implicit cues. This is the intersubjective field. This is when images start to burst into our minds, when we start to have ideas or thoughts or metaphor arising. And so I believe that this is precisely what we want to impart to our clients, because they have deadness in their body. The body brings us vitality states. And so somatic awareness, I think, is the linchpin of relational therapy. Daniel Stern, who also sadly passed away about 5 years ago, said present awareness is our primary subjective reality. If you recall, he studied infants. He wrote a book on present awareness. Over 60%, I read 60 to 90% of all communication is nonverbal. That's a lot of communication taking place that we're not talking about. Freud talked about evenly suspended attention, which I think is a beautiful phrase. We're sitting with evenly suspended attention, meaning we're regulated. We have good heart rate variability. When the person opposite is getting dysregulated, we're regulating them, downregulating or upregulating them. And Shore talks about a psychobiologically attuned dyad, that these are limbic conversations taking place. And Stern said that change takes place in actively constructed rather than reflective instances. So when we're reflecting back to our clients, that's nice. But where change really happens is when that right amygdala can read what's going on. So from a nod of the head, or a tilt of the head, or a facial expression, or a gesture of some sort, that's what the amygdala is starting to pick up and read as safety and encode down deep into the body. So it's our openness to the present moment that will restore these circuits that are down. And our clients split off consciousness. And we want this split off consciousness to integrate so that the intended role of creating an ongoing sense of self can be brought to fruition. You know, Bion talked about the mother watching the infant so that the infant could go on being. And Winnicott talked about the infant being the gleam in the mother's eye. And while our patients are not our children, these are human beings who were battered and bruised and horrendously treated as children. So they didn't get to come up to fruition. And many of them are so left-leaning, they're so narcissistic, they can be so off-putting because they're so dismissive that it's hard for some of us to stay present with that and see how deeply wounded and scared that human being really is. Because if you're going to get into a power struggle with that human being, you'll lose. But if you're going to move into a place of compassion, into your body, into your soul, they will melt before your very eyes, just like the Wicked Witch of the West did. Where clinical intuition is involved, imagery, sounds, gestures, metaphor. When our clients speak in metaphor, that is poetry. Mere mortals become poets in that moment. Memories, fantasies, feeling states, sexual arousal, all of these arrive before any words or equations can be employed. So I want to challenge you to start conducting your therapy strictly from your intuition. Try it for a week and see what happens. Dare to step into the unknown. I had an experience with a client once where I have an out-of-order card here, but I think I can remember this without the card. Just give me a second. Well, anyway, well, let me just say this. If we look at clinical intuition through the lens of interpersonal neurobiology, then we recognize it as a co-created resonant state. So we get the gist of something, right? You get a gut feeling of what's going on. And what's happening is both people are blending their unique histories together in that moment. So I have a client who I've seen for about 5 years now. This was a 50-year-old woman when she came in. She had attempted suicide, and she was a recovering alcoholic. And this was her second rodeo with suicide attempt. The first was in her 20s. She'd been married in her 20s for a short period of time, divorced, and then she was in this horrendous relationship with a man for her entire life, where he used her sexually in these really disgusting ways. One of which was that she'd have sex with other men and bring him the videotape to watch. He married and divorced other women. He had other girlfriends during these 3 decades, and he never, ever married her. But the reason he could even be in relationship with other women was because he always had her on the side. So they were in this really lethal sex and love addiction together. And his son died accidentally, and he went off the rails, and she went with him, and then she came. So after inpatient treatment, she did our 2-week intensive program for women. She was sitting with me one day, and she was talking about, I don't remember exactly what she was talking about. Oh, she was talking about how she's never taken a vacation in her life because she spent all this time with this man. And as she's talking, I start to drift off a little bit, and this August Strindberg play called Miss Julie pops into my head. Now, I've only ever read one August Strindberg play. Miss Julie is a monologue about 2 women that come together, I think, on Christmas Eve. It's snowing outside, and Mrs. X is the wife of the man Miss Y is having an affair with. And so Mrs. X starts pulling out these beautiful things she's bought for Christmas. Here are gloves for her son and a scarf for her daughter, and letting Miss Y know that she's never going to experience the joy of this because she never gets to have him on holidays. But then Mrs. X starts to lament how she never gets to have the best of him on vacations and go to parties with him and be his lover. And so this pops into my head, and I say to myself, my left brain comes in and says, don't tell her about the play. She doesn't need to know you read that and that you're, somewhat literate. Just shut up. So she keeps talking, and finally it comes back around like a gnat buzzing in my ear, right? This is my intuition. So I said, okay, I'm just going to say it. And so I say, Jane, do you by chance know this Strindberg play called Miss Julie? And she throws her head back in laughter, and she says, do I know it? She said, Alex, I know all the Strindberg plays. My ex-husband was president of the Strindberg Society. My jaw probably dropped in that moment, but these are the golden moments. No book will teach you that. This is about knowing yourself, bringing all of your juiciness and aliveness to therapy, of course, with boundaries, right? So take a moment to think about the collective unconscious where everyone is feeling the unsettledness of the world today. Look at the defensiveness and reactivity that we're seeing. If we can't be present for ourselves, we cannot possibly help other people. I think we're in a crisis in the world right now, too, where people are desperate to connect and they don't know how. The divisiveness, I think, in part is this tension between this deep desire to connect and being stymied about how to do it because we're all so busy, we're all running. Every single human being in this room has a computer in their pocket right now. That's unprecedented in human history. And so the ability to regulate ourselves again is going to be important, or we're not going to be able to help other people. And I think we're moving further away from secure attachment, as I said before. And so if you ask yourself these questions, if everyone could receive the therapy that I provide, how would the world be different? What do I need to cultivate in order to create secure attachment in myself and in other people? And what qualities do I dare bring forth? Recently, I was on this funny show called Problematic with Moshe Kasher, which is a new Comedy Central show, and he's super funny and very smart if you have a chance to watch it. But Nicholas Carr was on that show, who wrote The Shallows, if you've read that book. And one of the things Carr talks about in this book, I think he's a Harvard graduate, he's super smart and Pulitzer Prize winning, I'm pretty sure. He talks about how he was querying all of his friends and how all of his friends say how difficult it is to read a book anymore. And he says we're becoming more superficial. There's less time for meditation, contemplation, prayer, if that has meaning to you. We don't just sit and watch the day go by because we're constantly attending to this beeping computer in our pocket. So what we're suffering from is a lack of security, a lack of curiosity about diversity. Our left brains are swooping in and making assumptions like crazy now. Tensions are getting very, very high. But relational therapy moves us closer to this connection. So Jung says the difference we make between the psyche and the body is artificial. It's done for the sake of a better understanding, but in reality, there's nothing but a living body. Psyche is as much a living body as body is a living psyche. There is no separation. You are in your body. When people are tortured, they lose their minds. So you might be sitting there saying, well, what do I do about this? This sounds so grim. Jung said everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly in moments of unawareness. And we've probably all had that experience where some part of us has burst forth in an inelegant, not so pretty way. So here are some calls to action that I thought about and came up with, and they interestingly align with Pat Carnes' many things I've heard Pat Carnes say over the years. And so I was sort of chuckling to myself and thinking this is either because Mod 3 is just embedded in my psyche or because these are universal truths. So the first one is choice. And this is such a beautiful saying. He says the critical decision in life is to decide to come to your own assistance. At some point, you have to make the decision to change, the decision to go deeper, the decision to get out of your addiction, the decision to leave a bad relationship. Because when you make that decision, you're no longer a victim. You're actually stepping into your potential. And we ask our clients to leave their addictions. Oops, sorry about that. Which is the unconscious repetition of their trauma. And we ask them to lean into their pain, which is required of us in order to change. Where courage is concerned, I think we have to step into our own pain in order to evolve. I had to step into the pain of that car accident because I knew if I didn't, I would end up a vegetable of some sort. I'd be checked out, addicted to Valium, lost in space. And so for some reason, I knew that the only way out of that was to dive deeply into that darkness and into that pain. So do you think you're fine right now, or are you willing to keep striking out in order to know yourself more deeply? What parts of yourself are you not confronting right now? Maybe your own infidelity? Maybe your own porn addiction? Maybe the sexual thoughts that you're carrying about a client, or the bad relationship you're in, or the drug-addicted child you have, or your divorce, or your lack of sex in your marriage, or your aging body. All of us are struggling with something right now. And it's something that we'd rather not deal with, but the call is to deal with it because it never goes away. You know, we can clean up our family of origin issues, which is super important, but we're living day to day in a very fast-moving world and things are changing. And how willing are you? My husband sent me this a couple months ago because I was probably complaining about something about how hard life is. And it's just a beautiful quote. One doesn't discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time. So are you willing to know yourself, to take a leap of faith, to be vulnerable, to trust your intuition, to trust your somatic countertransference? That's one of the calls to action. And where pain is concerned, can you have an honest relationship with your pain, like the addict who hits bottom? Can you be honest with yourself and stop blaming and shaming other people? When somebody says to you, "How are you?" can you just not say "fine"? Can you say, I'm sad, or I'm struggling, or I'm super happy because this amazing thing happened, that I'm vitally alive? So you're all probably sick of seeing this because we teach this sort of ad nauseum around here, but it's one of my favorite things because it's a fractal, because this can apply to today, or it can apply to a project you're involved in with a year. It can be a week of recovery, or it can be a year of recovery. But what I want to tell you about this is that starting the Center for Healthy Sex is really a love story. Douglas and I got married, and we went to Greece on our honeymoon, and we were sitting on top of a mountain overlooking this beautiful, pristine island, and we were dreaming about our future. He was maybe going to go to UCLA and get an MBA, and I was going to be a therapist, and we were going to pool our resources, and we were going to do something amazing together. We just didn't know what it was. So there we were, innocently dreaming about this idea. And then we had this hunger, what he calls an entrepreneurial spasm, to start this business. And the initiation was getting the business started. So there we were, facing the ordeal. And that ordeal lasted for years. It lasted for a long time. And it was 24/7. I'm not kidding you. Some people would call it workaholism. But we were on fire, and we were also exhausted at times, picking each other off, having lost sight of the shore for a very long time. And we'd have moments of reflection and breakthrough. Until finally, I'm happy to say that here we are at a place of celebration. There's a lot of wild creativity going on at CHS right now that doesn't have a lot to do with Douglas and I. We have young people working that are passionate. They're passionate about this mission of healthy sexuality. And so it's taken on a life of its own, the way that books take on a life of their own, the way that anything we do, children take on a life of their own. So we have to risk stepping into that unknown. And knowing also and recognizing that too many modalities don't allow you to dog paddle at sea. So we have this certification, but I watch people, especially at conferences like this, like going crazy with anxiety that they have to get certified in the next thing. And books and certifications and tools will not make you a better therapist. Your pain, your own journey, and what you bring to your relationships will make you a better therapist. So if you're proficient at throwing a life preserver to your client all the time, they don't get to dog paddle around in their own psyche either. And sometimes we do that for our own anxiety. I think we put people on medication because it makes us feel better. Because we don't want to deal with that depression that's in front of us, because we have to go into the abyss of that depression and feel what we're feeling and feel where we're stuck and how it also bumps up against our own issues and deficiencies. So be mindful of really being willing to not know, to step into bringing and risking yourself into the therapy and having answers, as I was saying, eradicates the need for intimacy and connection. And this lack of answers requires a collaboration with the person sitting opposite you, and timing and working towards each other and grappling, the way a mother and infant fight for timing between the two of them. If the good mother will blend and bend to the infant's timing, the narcissistic mother will try to get the infant to bend towards her timing, and then you've got a mess on your hand. So as we are working constantly, silently, quietly to find out what's happening with that human being opposite us, then we're really willing to go through the muck and surrender our egos. And treatment can feel a lot less comfortable. I had a clinician in one of my consultation groups. I have a couple of groups where I have master level clinicians in these groups. They're people that really risk bearing their souls on any given month. And they bring in cases, and they're never about the cases. They're always about us and what's going on with us. And he wrote to the group and he said, I don't have a case this month, but I want to talk about a client that I'm stuck with. And every week it feels like I'm going around the same block all the time. And a number of group members wrote back and they said, oh yeah, we know that client. Let's talk about that. So here this man, this adult grown man brings in this situation with his client. And he starts to strip back really who he is to us. And before I know it, he's crying on the phone line, and we're silently just with him, holding him in this consciousness. And there's something so powerful about what he gave us. And I'm convinced that that client was changed as a result of that process, because I think where we're headed from here is we're moving towards extraordinary ways of knowing, because every one of you has a psychic story to tell. Every one of you has had that experience with a client where you've dreamt their childhood dream, or something's happened where you thought about them and they called you, something changed. This is an evolutionary process that we're in. So we have to be willing to stretch past the cognitive, past the left brain. And it's important to know the theory, but it's also to let that theory sit behind you, not have it be in the forefront, not have to sound so smart. Because every time you make an interpretation, you sound smart, but you kill the therapy in that moment. You do, because you go up left. So are you willing to muck around in the dirty, stinky, rank places that you have to smell and taste and touch the pain of this person sitting opposite you? Each one of us has to develop a way of working. We have to develop a way of getting into the pain and getting out of the pain. We also have to know when it's time to let go of the reins and let people go so they can go be the best that they can be. And the addiction model is fantastic for crisis. It holds us, it contains us so we can contain the patient, so we can start to move people into these areas. But regulation is needed at those times, not just containment, and they're not the same thing. So when people come out of crisis, any number of approaches are useful as long as you are bringing your authentic self to the relationship. Because when we're working with deep change, involving all of our senses and somatic processes are essential. We have to be facile enough to make the jump from one modality to the other, from shifting and changing ourselves all the time, and that requires our own regulation. And so this is about being as creative as you possibly can be. Because when we move into the not knowing, the risk is we're surfing this very big wave and not knowing how it's going to pan out. And as people get healthier, we have to release them, as I said, and let them go. So what is sex addiction treatment all about? Is it about sex addiction? I don't think so. I think it's about human potential, and it's about sexual potential, and anything less than that is a shortchanging of ourselves and of our clients. The only way for us to heal people is to heal ourselves. All of who we are plays out in our therapy, whether we like it or not. And when we see our creative capacities, our sexuality is beautiful, ourselves is whole and secure, then and only then can we transmit that to our clients. So our task is to heal our whole beings and our clients' whole beings, because we need an army of people right now in order to envision and construct a future of wholeness. Rumi said, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. All of you plays out in your therapy, whether you like it or not. There's no such thing as a tabula rasa. That was a lie. So be an artist. Play with the art and the science of psychotherapy, as Alan Shore says. Be fearless. And remember, everyone in this room has the power to change the world. Thank you.